"This house was never yours." My stepdad screamed it across the living room loud enough for the neighbors to hear. 20 minutes later, the lawyer called with the will. "My name is Rachel. I was 9 years old when my mother married Victor, a man who came into our lives with a certain confidence that, at the time, felt reassuring to a child who'd only ever known an absent father. Victor had built a modest but successful chain of hardware stores across our county, and the house we eventually moved into, a large colonial on the edge of town, quickly became something Victor referred to constantly as proof of everything he'd worked for. From the beginning, Victor made a clear distinction between his biological son, my stepbrother Tyler, 4 years older than me, and myself. It wasn't always obvious to outsiders. Victor was skilled at presenting a united family image whenever it mattered, at church functions, at his store's company picnics, in front of my mother's side of the family during holidays. But at home, behind closed doors, the distinction was unmistakable. Tyler's opinions carried weight at the dinner table. Mine were tolerated. Tyler's mistakes were framed as learning experiences. Mine were framed as evidence of some deeper flaw Victor seemed convinced I carried. I spent most of my adolescence trying to close a gap that I eventually came to understand was never actually mine to close. When I earned a spot on the debate team in high school, Victor asked once distractedly how it went, then moved on to discussing Tyler's baseball game in detail. When Tyler struggled academically, Victor hired him private tutors without hesitation. When I struggled briefly with a difficult math class my junior year, Victor told me I simply needed to try harder, the same tired phrase he reserved specifically for me and never once used with his son. My mother, for her part, existed in a kind of quiet tension throughout most of my childhood, caught between wanting to protect me and needing to maintain peace within a marriage that clearly ran on Victor's terms. She loved me, I never doubted that. But she also depended on Victor financially in ways that made real confrontation feel impossible for her, and I learned early on not to expect her to intervene, even when I desperately wanted her to. By the time I left for college, the relationship between Victor and me had settled into something coldly functional at best. We spoke when necessary. We avoided real conversation whenever possible. I built my life deliberately far from that house, studying environmental engineering at a university several states away, choosing a field Victor never fully understood or expressed much interest in, which honestly suited me just fine at the time. My mother passed away unexpectedly 6 years ago, from a sudden cardiac event that none of us saw coming. Her death fractured whatever fragile peace had existed in that family. Without her as a buffer between us, Victor's coldness toward me sharpened considerably, no longer softened by her presence in the room. Tyler, for his part, seemed to absorb Victor's attitude toward me almost by osmosis, treating me increasingly like an inconvenient obligation rather than a sibling, someone who showed up occasionally out of a sense of duty rather than genuine connection. What none of them knew in the years following my mother's passing was that she had quietly updated her own estate planning 18 months before she died, following a private conversation the two of us had during one of my visits home. She'd inherited a meaningful sum of money years earlier from her own parents, money that had technically remained separate from Victor's assets throughout their entire marriage, kept in accounts under her name alone. During that visit, she told me plainly that she wanted to make sure I was protected financially, regardless of whatever happened within the family after she was gone. I hadn't thought much about the details at the time. I simply trusted her the way I always had. The house itself, however, remained legally in Victor's name alone, purchased years before he'd even met my mother, which meant I'd never held any claim to it directly, something Victor reminded me of constantly whenever the subject of the family home came up in any conversation. That fact became central to an argument that finally erupted 3 weeks ago, during what was supposed to be a relatively simple visit to help sort through some of my mother's remaining belongings that Victor had never gotten around to donating. Tyler had recently gone through a difficult divorce and, without much discussion beforehand, moved back into the house with Victor, into what had once been my old childhood bedroom, now converted entirely into space for him. During that visit, I mentioned gently I thought that a few boxes of my mother's old photographs and personal items were still stored in that room, and asked if I might be able to go through them before anything else got rearranged or thrown away. Victor's reaction caught me completely off guard. He told me sharply that I needed to stop acting like I still had some claim to that house or anything inside it, that Tyler lived there now, that it had always been Victor's house regardless of who had lived there over the years. When I tried to explain I was only asking about my mother's personal belongings, not the house itself, Victor's voice rose even further, and he said the words that would end up defining that entire evening. This house was never yours. It was never going to be yours. You need to understand that and stop coming around here acting entitled to things that were never meant for you. I stood in that living room in the house I'd grown up in from the age of 9, and felt something inside me finally, quietly settle into place. I didn't argue with him. I simply told him I understood, gathered the few boxes he grudgingly allowed me to take and left. Almost exactly 20 minutes after I pulled out of that driveway while I was still driving, my phone rang. It was my mother's attorney, a woman named Diane who had handled her estate planning years earlier and who I hadn't spoken with directly since shortly after the funeral. Diane explained that she'd been trying to reach me for several days regarding a provision in my mother's will that had recently, a small lakeside cottage inherited from her own mother decades earlier, one Victor had never shown much interest in over the years since it required maintenance he considered more trouble than it was worth. Diane explained that under the terms of my mother's will, that cottage, along with the remaining balance of her separate inherited funds, had been left entirely to me, structured specifically through a trust my mother had established to ensure it remained protected regardless of any circumstances that might arise within the family afterward. The total value, Diane explained carefully, came to considerably more than I had ever realized, since my mother had quietly invested much of that inheritance over the years without ever discussing the specific details with me directly. I sat in my car on the side of the road for nearly 20 minutes after that call ended, processing everything at once. Victor's words still echoing from 20 minutes earlier. This house was never yours, layered against Diane's careful explanation of exactly what actually was mine, entirely, legally, permanently, regardless of anything Victor believed about my place within that family. I didn't call Victor that night to tell him. I didn't feel any particular urgency to share the information, not out of spite, but because it genuinely wasn't his business, the same way the house had genuinely never been mine. Instead, I spent the following weeks quietly working with Diane to finalize the transfer of the cottage and the trust into my name, arranging the paperwork carefully, methodically, the way I approached most significant decisions in my life. Word eventually reached Victor and Tyler about 6 weeks later. Not through me directly, but through a mutual family friend who mentioned it in passing during a conversation with Tyler, assuming he already knew. Tyler called me shortly afterward, his tone noticeably different from our usual strained exchanges, asking if it was true that I'd inherited the lakeside cottage. I confirmed that it was, without offering much additional detail beyond what he'd already heard. Victor called 2 days after that, the first time he'd reached out to me directly in nearly a year. His tone had shifted considerably from the one I'd heard screaming at me in that living room weeks earlier. He explained, somewhat awkwardly, that Tyler had mentioned wanting to eventually use the cottage for family gatherings, the way we apparently used to when I was very young, before I could really remember. I told Victor honestly that I hadn't yet decided what I wanted to do with the property, but that I'd let him know if my plans changed. What became clear to me in the weeks and months that followed was something I hadn't fully expected going into any of this. Victor's sudden interest in reconnecting had far less to do with genuine remorse over how he'd treated me for over 2 decades, and far more to do with the fact that I now controlled something he and Tyler had quietly begun to want access to themselves. It was a realization that stung less than I might have expected, mostly because some part of me had already understood long before that phone call in the car, exactly what kind of relationship this had always been. I renovated the cottage myself over the following year, using a portion of the inheritance my mother had left me, turning it into something entirely my own, separate from any memory of Victor or the house he'd screamed at me in. I still see Tyler occasionally, our relationship slowly, carefully rebuilding itself outside the shadow Victor had always cast over both of us. Victor and I speak rarely now, brief, polite exchanges during the holidays, nothing more than that, and honestly nothing more than that feels right to me at this point in my life. I think about that evening sometimes, standing in that living room while Victor screamed that the house had never been mine. He was right in the strictest legal sense, and he never let me forget it for a single day of my childhood. What he never understood, not even now, is that my mother had spent years quietly ensuring I'd never actually need that house or his approval, or anything else he believed he was protecting from me. She left me something else entirely, something built specifically to outlast him. I never wanted revenge in any of this, not really. I only wanted, finally, to understand that I had never actually needed what he kept insisting was never mine in the first place. In the end, my mother made certain of that long before Victor ever raised his voice in that living room. If someone in your own family ever tried to convince you that you didn't belong to something you'd spent your whole life believing was yours, I'd genuinely like to know. Did their words define how you saw yourself for years afterward? Or did you eventually discover, the way I did, that you never needed their permission to belong to something all along?